Boa tarde a todos, bem-vindos a mais um Labô Lectures, diretamente de São Paulo, Porto Alegre, né, Lucas?
Isso?
São Paulo, comigo e com o Fernando, Porto Alegre com o Lucas e Tennessee com o professor Larry Bartels. É uma grande honra ter vocês aqui com a gente e o professor Bartels, convidado pelo nosso embaixador do Labô, professor Fernando Amed. E estão todos me ouvindo? Estão todos vendo bem a imagem e tudo mais? A gente precisa fazer toda essa cena. Cena no sentido das boas-vindas, porque a gente tem um delay do Zoom para o Facebook, então por isso que eu tenho que fazer essa fala inicial para todo mundo ficar esperto. Seguinte, gente, é um grande prazer receber o professor Larry Bartels aqui, juntamente com o Fernando Amed, coordenador do nosso grupo de pesquisa sobre comportamento político, e hoje com o Lucas. O Lucas é pesquisador tanto do grupo de comportamento político quanto do núcleo de filosofia política, está lá no Rio Grande do Sul e é graduado em comunicação social pela PUC do Rio Grande do Sul. Então, como é que a gente vai fazer isso hoje? Eu vou passar a palavra para eles, depois o professor Bartels vai fazer a apresentação dele e depois, como sempre, a gente vai abrir para as perguntas. Boa tarde a todos que estão aqui comigo, que eu estou vendo os recados, e muito obrigada. Com vocês. Fernando.
Well, Professor Bartels, we are very proud to receive you here in São Paulo. It's an honor for us. Your book with Christopher Akin is very important for our research. I thank you so much, Professor. Lucas.
Sim. Thank you, Professor. I'll just say some words in Portuguese to present you to our public, Professor. O professor Larry Bartels é um cientista político americano, mestre em ciência política pela Universidade de Yale, doutor em ciência política pela Universidade da Califórnia em Berkeley e co-diretor do Centro para o Estudo das Instituições Democráticas. Ele também é membro do Departamento de Políticas Públicas e Ciências Sociais na Universidade Vanderbilt, com passagens pelas universidades de Princeton e Rochester, e é autor do livro Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government, do qual ele vai tratar aqui conosco hoje. Professor Bartels, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to be here with us today. And please.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I wish I could be with you in person, but I hope that will happen at some point in the future. Share my slides with you here. There, I hope you can see that. So I'm talking about this book, Democracy for Realists, which was published in 2016 and is very much a joint work with my longtime teacher and friend, Chris Aiken, who's actually just retired from Princeton University. We start by considering the relationship between democratic ideals and democratic realities, and to give a kind of overview of the way most ordinary people think about this, I want to just share with you some survey data from the World Values Survey, which has repeatedly asked people in a lot of different countries, first of all, how important is it for you to live in a democracy? And secondly, how democratically is this country being governed? And in the figure here, the green bars are average ratings of the importance of democracy on a 1 to 10 scale, and the red bars are assessments of how democratically the country is actually being governed. And you can see that in every country, there's a gap between the two. People attach more importance to democracy than they have confidence in the reality of democratic performance in their own country. The size of the gap varies somewhat from country to country. Unfortunately, I guess I don't have Brazil in this list of countries, but for readers in the US, we called attention especially to the comparison between the United States and China, which are right next to each other in the middle of the graph here, almost exactly similar in terms of the importance that people in China and people in the United States attach to the importance of democracy, but maybe even more surprisingly, almost exactly similar assessments of how democratically their own country is being governed. Obviously, you have to make some allowance for the incentives of survey respondents in these different places. But I think there's an interesting insight here into the variety of governing procedures that people think of as being compatible with democracy in different times and places. Our ideas about what democracy consists of are largely matters of convention, and they vary from time to time and from place to place. So how should we think about this connection between the ideals of democracy and the reality? I think a lot of scholars think about it in the way that was suggested by Robert Dahl in one of his little books that he wrote late in his career about democracy. He wrote, "No state has ever possessed a government that fully measured up to the criteria of a democratic process. None is likely to. Yet the criteria provide highly serviceable standards for measuring the achievements and possibilities of democratic government. They can serve as guides for shaping and reshaping concrete arrangements, constitutions, practices, and political institutions." That sounds like a compelling justification for matching up what we see in realities against the ideals of democracy, but we want to call it into question by pointing out a kind of comparison from a kind of acerbic book on political psychology that was written more than a century ago by Graham Wallas. He started out by writing, "No doctor would now begin a medical treatise by saying the ideal man requires no food and is impervious to the action of bacteria, but this ideal is far removed from the actualities of any known population. No modern treatise on pedagogy begins with the statement that the ideal boy knows things without being taught them, and his sole wish is the advancement of science. But no boys at all like this have ever existed." In our view, this is kind of the analog to the notion of democratic ideals that Dahl is offering as a basis for considering not only the reality of democracy in different political systems, but also constructing roadmaps about how to reform democracy. If the ideal is this unrealistic, it seems to me that it may be a very imperfect roadmap for thinking about how we can make actual improvements in democratic practice. Then we have a section of the book that tries to tackle directly this idea that Dahl offered, that elections offer citizens the opportunity to control public policy. This is from an older work that he wrote back in the middle of the 20th century. He writes, "Popular sovereignty requires that whenever policy choices are perceived to exist, the alternative selected and enforced as governmental policy is the alternative most preferred by the members of the relevant political community." That's a kind of high-minded way of thinking about what elections are supposed to accomplish. We call it the folk theory of democracy. The same point has been put in a less abstract way by the political writer H.L. Mencken. Again, more than a century ago, Mencken wrote, "Democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard." Although we have a lot of reason to think that this isn't what elections actually do, there's a common tendency among election analysts, as well as in the public generally, to think that this is at least an approximation to what elections are about. And we want to say that that's not the case. So let me just run quickly through some of the problems that we identify in this folk theory of democracy, as we call it. First, there's a logical indeterminacy of what it is that we're trying to capture in the first place. If you have read or heard about Arrow's theorem, it's a very broad mathematical demonstration of the complexity of thinking about preference aggregation. What is the alternative most preferred by the members of a polity? As soon as the range of alternatives to be chosen among gets it all complicated, even in principle, it's hard to know what an answer to that question would be. Secondly, there's psychological indeterminacy in individual preferences. Insofar as we can get at them using survey data, we've seen all kinds of examples where framing questions in one way or another produces very different results. Sometimes very slight changes in wording can change the distribution of responses. People give different responses to the same questions in different contexts and so on. So even if we had a way to aggregate those preferences into a collective choice, it's not clear what the preferences themselves are. Then there are problems that have to do with political ignorance. Political scientists have suggested a variety of ways in which those might be addressed. Heuristics, information shortcuts, the miracle of aggregation, so-called, which argues that although individual preferences may be quite erratic, collective preferences are much less so. All of those are important considerations, but none of them gets completely around the fact that people express different views both individually and collectively than they would if they were fully informed. And finally, what we call the illusion of issue voting. There's still, even among electoral analysts, a strong tendency to imagine that election outcomes are heavily, if not entirely, determined by the preferences of voters with respect to political issues. But the evidence that's generally produced in favor of that prospect is, in fact, I think, quite misleading as a general matter. We take these issue preferences as being exogenous explanatory variables, when in fact we have lots of good reason to think that they're more often consequences of electoral choices than they are actual causes of electoral choices. And as a result, elections actually don't do very much to constrain the ideological predilections of political elites. This is a kind of summary from a recent US Congress of the relationship between citizens' preferences and the behavior of their elected officials, members of Congress. So along the horizontal axis, I have each congressional district ranked by the conservatism of public opinion as measured by a scale of about a dozen prominent political issues. So it's a kind of summary measure of how liberal on the left or conservative on the right the districts are. And then from the bottom to the top is a summary measure of the behavior of the elected officials based on a scaling of all the roll call votes they cast in Congress over a 2-year period, with the most conservative representatives on the top and the most liberal representatives on the bottom. And the red diamonds are the Republican members of Congress, and the blue circles are the Democratic members of Congress. And you can see within each of those two groups, there's a mild positive relationship between the ideology or the preferences of the constituents and the ideology of the elected officials. But those relationships are rather weak. And if you look in the middle of the scale, in relatively moderate districts that could easily elect a Democrat or a Republican, you can see that the average behavior of Republicans representing those districts is vastly different from the average behavior of Democrats representing similar districts. So there's a much bigger gap between the behavior of Republicans and Democrats representing similar districts than there is between a Democrat representing the most liberal district in the country and a Democrat representing the most conservative district in the country. We see a similar kind of pattern with respect to the positions of the parties in presidential elections. Here's a tracing going back to 1980 of the perceived positions of the Republican and Democratic presidential candidates on a general ideological scale. And you get similar patterns with respect to specific issues that have been asked about regularly in these American National Election Studies surveys. You can see that Democrats are uniformly very far to the left of the swing voters in the middle of the distribution. Republicans are very uniformly far to the right of the swing voters. And if anything, those gaps have increased in recent elections by comparison to what they had been previously. So if presidents get elected one way or another and then in office pursue the positions that they took as platform statements during the campaign, they're not going to be reflecting the preferences of the median voter by any means. So political scientists who've noted a lot of these peculiarities in the behavior of elected officials have, at least to some extent, abandoned the idea that elections are referenda on policy issues in favor of what's often called retrospective voting, the view that voters are mostly voting on the basis of their assessments of how well or badly the incumbent party has run the country. In his book on this subject in the 1980s, Mofi Arena said, retrospective voters need not know the precise economic or foreign policies of the incumbent administration in order to see or feel the results of those policies. If jobs have been lost in a recession, something is wrong. If sons have died in foreign rice paddies, something is wrong. If thugs make neighborhoods unsafe, something is wrong. If polluters foul food, water, or air, something is wrong. This is an attractive alternative to the conventional view because it seems to put less stringent demands on voters. They don't have to understand everything about the policy preferences of the competing parties. They just have to be able to monitor circumstances and make judgments about whether things are going well or badly. This has often in the literature been taken as being a way out of the apparent difficulties of democracy. Gerald Kramer, in his seminal paper on the topic, for example, wrote that election outcomes are not irrational or random or solely the product of past loyalties and habits or of campaign rhetoric and merchandising. Or even more pithily, Vioki wrote that voters are not fools. But it seems to us that retrospective voting is actually a good deal harder than it looks in these accounts. One question is whether voters can reliably discern changes in their own welfare. If you think about pollution, for example, voters have only a very indirect sense of whether the overall level of pollution is improved or worsened over time. In fact, the US Environmental Protection Agency once looked at a survey data on the assessed importance of different environmental threats among ordinary citizens and found no correlation at all with the views of environmental experts about these different problems. And so they took to trying to train citizens to reflect expert judgments about changes in their own welfare in the domain of the environment. But in general, environment and crime and other conditions are hard for ordinary citizens to monitor without a good deal of help. And even if they can tell whether things are going well or badly, it may be difficult for them to use those changes to ascertain whether the incumbents have performed poorly or well, since obviously a lot of these conditions are only partly under the control of the incumbent leaders. There's a lot of good or bad luck that goes into them as well. Excuse me. So which aspects of voter subjective well-being are plausibly attributable to incumbent leaders' policies or performance? We try and get at that question by considering an extreme case of blind retrospection, namely voters' responses to shark attacks. This is based on a series of events in New Jersey, where Chris and I were both based at the time that we were thinking about this problem, but going back almost a century from when the book was published to 1918, where there was a series of shark attacks along the Jersey Shore, the tourist areas along the ocean coast in New Jersey. First, on July 1st, a swimmer was killed by a shark in Beach Haven. And then about a week later, another person was killed by a shark in Spring Lake, again, right along the ocean. And then another week after that, 2 boys were maimed by a shark in a creek, not in the ocean, but near the ocean in a place called Matawan. These attacks got an increasing degree of publicity, not only local publicity, but national publicity. And you can see something about the tone of the coverage over time. The response to the first attack was a story headlined, "Dies After Attack by Fish." That reflected the fact that experts at the time didn't think that sharks would actually attack people, and so they didn't believe that this was actually a shark attack. But by the time of the third shark attack, the coverage was becoming a lot more alarmist. East Coast begins war on ravenous man-eaters. Of course, there was nothing that they could do to actually prevent the sharks from attacking people. If people were going to go out in the ocean, the sharks were going to attack them. Nonetheless, there was a great deal of upset about this. And if you look at the impact on voting behavior in the subsequent election, President Wilson, who was from New Jersey and whose summer home was located near where the shark attacks occurred, was pretty significantly punished at the polls in the next election in the places whose economic livelihoods had been damaged by this series of events in the summer of 1918. So people were, in fact, punishing the incumbent for shark attacks. Well, that's just one incident. And so we also looked at a broader pattern of responses to natural calamities by looking at assessments of the weather in presidential elections over the entire course of the 20th century. The US national government has kept records of basically whether the ground was too wet or too dry in each part of the country in every year. And so we've used those to measure electoral responses to droughts and floods over this period. You can see that there's a lot of variability from election year to election year, but most of these bars are going to the left, which is to say that incumbents are being punished for bad weather on a pretty regular basis. You see the same kind of pattern if you look at responses to economic conditions in recent presidential elections. At the time the book was written, we had data from 1952 to 2012, and this is the statistical relationship between income growth in the months leading up to the election and the incumbent party's performance in those presidential elections. You can see a very strong positive relationship. And it's important to notice here that this is a very short-term measure of economic growth. It's just the 2 quarters of the year leading up to the election. So even if voters were right to reward or punish the incumbent president for economic performance over his entire term, that's not really what they're doing. What they're doing is punishing or rewarding them for what's happened in the few months leading up to the election. So it's a very myopic kind of retrospection. I'll just say that the 2016 election also fit almost perfectly with this pattern. The 2020 election did not, for reasons that I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. We also did some looking at the Great Depression in the US in the 1930s. You might think that in a situation of economic emergency, people would be more focused on getting this right. But the pattern in that era looks quite similar to the pattern that we saw in the recent data, which is to say that support for Roosevelt was strongly affected by economic change in the year of the election. So in 1934 and 1935, Roosevelt presided over huge increases in income in the US as the country was growing out of the Depression. As best we can tell, he got no electoral benefit for that income growth. But income growth in 1936, in the election year, was strongly related to his gain in support in 1936 by comparison with 1932. People often have elaborate ideological interpretations of the 1936 election. It seems to us that what happened there was not so much an ideological ratification of the New Deal, but simply a reaction of the sort that we almost always see to improvements in economic conditions in particular places. So we think there is a lot of retrospective voting going on, but that it doesn't have the happy properties that analysts often want to associate with retrospective voting in terms of rationality and producing electoral accountability. But we think mostly what's going on determines most of the individual voting behavior that we observe in elections has to do with social identity. So in the book, we have a variety of examples of analyses that are intended to get at the impact of identity politics in elections. Of course, the book doesn't include The even more striking examples in recent US history, but I'll say a little bit about those at the end. One example is the 1960 election, in which John Kennedy, a Catholic, was the first Catholic elected president, the second major party nominee who was a Catholic. And you see in that election a huge shift in voting behavior and a smaller but still substantial shift in party identification among Catholics relative to non-Catholics. People at the time noticed that. They took it as being kind of a natural thing. Catholics were supporting the Catholic candidate. But we think this is an interesting example because it's not one in which there's any plausible policy interpretation of the significance of Kennedy's Catholicism. Nobody thought that the Pope was going to be dictating policy if Kennedy was in the White House, or that he would take different positions on major issues than some other Democrat who happened not to be a Catholic would. So we think of this as a pretty pure example of identity politics. And you can see that that Catholic advantage in Democratic Party identification already existed before 1960. It was increased in 1960, but has eventually died away again for reasons that don't have much to do with policy preferences. Another interesting example is the example of abortion, one of the most morally fraught issues that any society deals with, one where the positions of the parties changed pretty significantly during the 1980s and 1990s in the wake of the famous Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. What I'm showing you here is the pattern of switching from pro-life to pro-choice views among men and women over that 15-year period. This is based on panel data where the same people were interviewed in 1982 and 1997. And you see that there are significant numbers of conversions from pro-life to pro-choice views among both men and women, but there are more among men than there are among women. But what's more important for us is that there were many more among Democrats than there were among Republicans. What's going on here is that over this period, the Democratic Party is increasingly being seen as the pro-choice party. The Republican Party is increasingly being seen as the pro-life party. Some people are changing their party identifications in response to those events, mostly women, but in relatively small numbers. But there's an even larger percentage of people who are switching their views about abortion to bring them into line with their party identification. So these are people who are taking advice about the most fraught moral issue facing the country on the basis of partisan cues from the leaders of whatever party they happen already to be associated with. This is one important example, I think, of a broader range of phenomena that have to do with people basing their beliefs on what's convenient to believe based on their party identification or their other social identities. But we think it's important to notice that this applies not just to people's opinions, even about things like abortion, but also to their factual beliefs. So here's an analysis of responses to a factual question that was included in a survey in 1996 about whether the budget deficit had gotten better or worse, whether it had increased or decreased. And you see the responses here for Democrats and Republicans as a function of political information, which is an estimate of how much these people know about politics, how closely they're paying attention to politics. It's based on their correct responses to a variety of questions about factual matters, like how many Supreme Court justices there are and who's the Prime Minister of Great Britain and so on. So as we move from the left to the right, we're getting the least well-informed people on the very far left and the most well-informed people on the very far right. The other thing you have to know about the political context here is that the president for the preceding 4 years had been a Democrat, Bill Clinton, and the budget deficit had actually shrunk considerably under Clinton's time in office. If you look at the responses of Democrats, most Democrats, up to about the 2/3 point in the distribution of political information, on average, had no idea what had happened. They were just as likely to say that things had gotten worse as to say that they had gotten better. But in the top third or so of the distribution of information, you see that Democrats are clued into what's going on, and they're much more likely to say that the budget deficit had actually decreased over Clinton's time in office, which was the correct answer. If you look at the Republicans, you see a very different pattern. Over the bottom half of the distribution of political information, as people become more informed, they're actually consistently getting the answer wrong. They're more wrong. The Republicans with average levels of political information are more wrong on average than the ones who are completely uninformed, because the ones who are completely uninformed are just guessing at random, whereas the ones who are moderately informed know just enough to think that it's embarrassing for their party if a Democrat had improved the budget deficit situation. So they're likely to say that the budget deficit had gotten worse. And it's only when you get up into the top 10 or 15% of the distribution of political information that they know enough to actually note the reality that the budget deficit had improved. So in this example, it's the Republicans who are mostly getting things wrong as they become more informed. But it's nothing special about Republicans here. There are examples where you can show the same phenomenon going on with Democrats. The point is simply that people with moderate amounts of information are basing their beliefs on what they know should be the case rather than what is in fact the case. We think there's a lot of that going on. So with all these difficulties, what's good about democracy? We have a concluding chapter. Any book like this has to have a concluding chapter that says something about what's good. And we struggled to write it, but we came up with some ideas about what's good about democracy. First, as V.O. Key wrote long ago, an election helps to mitigate violence because it provides a mechanism by which everybody agrees on who's supposed to be in charge. All concerned abide by the toss of the coin, as Key put it. The essential randomness of election outcomes prevents any single party or group from becoming entrenched in power. One of the patterns that I didn't talk about was that we see a pretty strong tendency for people to get tired of the incumbent party, regardless of what they do, the longer they've been in power, and that has some good properties. Neglected groups, if they're not too unpopular socially, are attractive targets for recruitment, and that makes democracies relatively inclusive. You often see over time increases in the electorate as each party wrangles to get included in the electorate people who they think will support them. And re-election seeking politicians strive to avoid salient violations of consensual norms. The example of that we gave in the book is that you don't often see the president strangling a kitten on national television because that's something that voters are likely to react to badly. So a bit about the critical reaction to this book. Over the 15 years or so that we spent writing it, we got a lot of complaints from people who said that things couldn't be nearly as bad as we claimed they were. So we were widely castigated for being much too pessimistic about the state of things. Then there was an election in 2016, just several months after the book was published. And at that point, the critical response changed pretty substantially in response mostly to the example of Donald Trump. People began to think, well, yeah, of course, this is the way that voters behave. My favorite review of the book was from Ezra Klein, who's now a columnist for the New York Times, who wrote, "Neither their arguments nor their evidence is surprising, at least not exactly. What's unusual is their willingness to admit what the research actually reveals. This book is the political science equivalent of being told Santa doesn't exist. It makes sense once you think about it, but everyone has spent years telling you otherwise, and so the revelation comes as a trauma." And of course, now people worry that things may be even worse than we claim they were. Just two examples of that. All concerned abide by the toss of the coin. Well, we saw in the most recent election in the US that all don't abide by the toss of the coin. We had an instance in which there was substantial controversy about the outcome of the election. And the business about strangling kittens isn't so obvious either. Donald Trump famously said during the 2016 campaign, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose any support." And I think the behavior of his supporters over the last 5 years make that a pretty credible sounding claim. So I want to say just a little bit about the current circumstances. Here are some responses from a survey that I conducted in January of 2020, so just over a year ago now, before the big run-up in discussion about election fraud on the part of Trump and other Republicans in the run-up to the 2020 election. But I asked people who were Republicans or Republican-leaning independents this series of questions and asked them to agree or disagree with them. It's hard to trust the results of elections when so many people will vote for anyone who offers a handout. About 75% of Republicans agreed with that statement. The traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. Just over half of Republicans agreed with that statement. And a time will come when patriotic Americans have to take the law into their own hands. About 40% of Republicans agreed with that one, and a little over 20% disagreed. So there's clearly a lot of what might be termed anti-democratic sentiment here. And I wrote a piece that was published last summer that analyzed these data and tried to think about the ways in which these kinds of views among rank and file Republicans might produce problems for democracy in two respects. First of all, in terms of providing a kind of picture of the extremism of views among a relatively small set of people who have more intense versions of these same attitudes that ordinary Republicans express in large numbers. And secondly, in terms of encouraging political leaders to take anti-democratic actions, knowing that there was a good deal of support for those actions among their rank and file supporters. And I think if you think about what happened in the January insurrection or riot, whatever you want to call it, at the US Capitol, there was a lot of both of those things going on. And so the analysis that I did back last summer tried to get at the bases of these anti-democratic views among the Republican rank and file, looking at three bundles of attitudes and preferences, one having to do with economic conservatism and the role of government, the second having to do with what I call cultural conservatism, which has to do with religious and moral traditionalism and rural areas versus cities and that kind of thing. And the third of which is what I call ethnic antagonism, which has to do basically with concerns among white people about the increasing political and social status
There is a problem. Professor Bartels, I think, I was going to say Professor Bartels has left the building, but it's not like this. Okay. So Professor, you're back. Open the microphone again. You can unmute you.
Sorry about that.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. So I think these ethnic antagonisms among white Republicans are largely grounded in a kind of ethnic panic that has to do with people's perception, first of all, that the social role of these groups has changed a lot over the past half century, but maybe even more importantly, the prospect of an increasingly diverse nation and the prospect indeed of a minority majority America. There are some interesting psychological experiments that show that simply reminding people of the fact that the demography of the US is changing is enough to trigger these conservative views among many Republicans. But the other thing that I want to point out with this graph that shows how these attitudes vary across the different generations within the US is that although there's going to be some significant decline in cultural conservatism and economic conservatism as the currently oldest people exit the electorate, the change with respect to ethnic antagonism among people who were born before the 50s and in the 50s and 60s and 70s is really very modest. And so I think the rate of generational replacement, liberalizing people's views with respect to ethnic antagonism, is likely to be quite slow. And as a result, the politics of the US over the next 30 or 40 years are likely to be very difficult as a result of these identity tensions. So let me stop there and take your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was great. Thank you. Thank you. We have many, many questions. We are going to select some of them to ask you. First of all, before Lucas starts his questions and the questions we've already organized and the questions that came to us some minutes ago, I want to come back to the part that in the middle of your talk that you said that we wanted to comment the 2020 election, and here we are. So before you mentioned JFK and these things, so please.
Yeah, what I wanted to say about 2020 is that the normal pattern of economic voting that we've observed in recent presidential elections was badly thrown out of kilter in 2020 by a peculiarity of the circumstances having to do with the response to COVID. If you simply look at changes in people's incomes, which is what I've done statistically looking at previous elections, it turns out that 2020 was a big boom year. People's incomes were increasing substantially. That was because of all the government stimulus efforts that put a lot of money into people's pockets on a short-term basis. But if you look at the overall state of the economy, for example, at GDP, you see a huge downturn in 2020. What we seem to have gotten in the election outcome itself was a response that kind of split the difference between those two. If you look at the exit surveys, people were about evenly divided between thinking that the economy was in good shape and thinking it was in bad shape. That seems kind of strange, but I think is a testament to the strength of these partisan factors in influencing people's perceptions of reality. So the people who thought that the economy was going well, and also, as it happens, thought that the nation's response to the COVID pandemic was going well, were, of course, overwhelmingly Republicans and overwhelmingly supportive of Trump. Whereas the people who thought the economy was going badly and that the crisis had been handled badly were overwhelmingly Democrats and overwhelmingly supportive of Biden. I, among others, thought, based on this work that I had done on responses to previous natural disasters, that Trump would be heavily penalized by the COVID crisis, and especially so because there was such a widespread perception that he had handled it very badly. But in fact, there's very little evidence of that in the election returns. And I think that's a testament to the power of these partisan prejudices in the current US system.
Thank you so much. Lucas, please.
So, Professor, I would like to ask a question about the issue of identity in politics. It seems to me that it's not obvious that what you talk about this question of identity, social identities in politics, is not exactly the same as what is being talked about in the public debate about identitarian politics. And so I wanted to ask this question to you. Is there any difference between what we see normally in the public debate when we hear this thing about identitarian politics and what you talk about in your book about the question of identity in politics, or is it the same thing? The reason I'm asking this is I remember the article from Mark Lilla about the 2016 Trump's election, and he kind of blamed the identitarian swing in the left for that that election, for Democrats losing that election. So my question is, was he right in that aspect, or is it the other way around? Trump actually played better the game of identity politics. What are your thoughts on this?
I think in terms of thinking about the distinction, I would say that identitarian in the specific sense that you described is one very specific instance of this much broader phenomenon of identity politics, and often is used in the kind of disparaging way that you just described, Leela using it. That is that Democrats talk too much and worry too much about these particular identity groups. What's less obvious in that argument is exactly the point that you made, that, you know, white identity is an identity too. That's something that people studying identities often didn't pay much attention to until recently, and now has become a really interesting topic of analysis among political scientists and others. So I want to say, you know, the particular kinds of identities that identitarian often points to as a term of abuse is just one instance of many that are important in politics. And one of the important phenomena here is that people have lots of different identities that are more or less politically salient. And one of the things that political actors do is to help to make specific identities more or less salient at particular times. And Trump, I think, has certainly succeeded in part by calling attention to aspects of white identity and offering symbolic support for the kinds of concerns that people had who were resentful of other identity groups getting attention. One of the most interesting survey results that you see in all sorts of recent US surveys is in response to a question about discrimination against white people. Most white people are concerned about discrimination against whites, which, and often will say, you know, discrimination against whites is even more severe than discrimination against other groups, which strikes me as being kind of nutty, but I think is a useful indication of how strongly they feel about the sense in which their own group is threatened, or the status of their group is threatened by what they see going on around them. So there are certainly elements of social change that help to make these identities salient, but political activity helps to make them salient as well. The other thing I would say is that in the current political environment in the US, one of the things that has made all of this more intense and maybe more dangerous is that partisanship has increasingly come to be correlated with, and indeed to subsume, a lot of specific identities. So ethnic identities and gender identities and religious identities are all more strongly correlated with partisanship now than they used to be. And so I think that makes the situation in some ways more volatile than it had been in the past.
Thank you so much, Professor. There's a question from the audience, okay, Lucas, that I'm going to ask, that I think it's very important. Professor, there's a group of us that studied your book in March 2017. And then our teacher, that is the director of this laboratory, teacher Pondé, our professor, he commented that democracy is a system whose fate is controlled by contingency, was not the idea that, I'm sorry, the question is not, the idea that contingency was not consolidated in politics, but only is in philosophy, is the idea of the debate of the democracy. Given the data that you collected in January 2020 that you mentioned, do you think that the data seems to outline that anti-democratic attitudes that might be rising? Is this a trend? And could you comment a bit more about the difference in generational attitudes?
We don't have very good data about attitudes toward democracy and democratic tolerance consistently over a long period of time, but there are some terrific studies. Social scientists were, not surprisingly, very concerned about this question in the wake of the fascist period. And so there were some really important surveys done in the 1950s trying to get at people's attitudes about democracy as a system, and some articles that were published in the late 50s and 1960s that I think are relevant here. My interpretation of what they showed is that almost everybody will express support for democracy in the abstract. And indeed, although I don't have questions of that kind in the survey that I showed you, my guess is that these people, if you just ask them a bold question about whether democracy is a good thing, they would certainly be likely to say yes. But when you push people and create tensions or conflicts between their abstract attachment to democracy as a political system and their substantive political views, they're often quite likely to throw over abstract democracy in favor of their substantive preferences, if those are strongly held. In the data from the 1950s, that mostly had to do with willingness to ban communists from giving speeches or to treat African Americans badly, for example. Nowadays, they have to do with these specific concerns about the way other people are benefiting from the electoral process, or the ways other groups are changing the American way of life by introducing new ideas. And so I think in that sense, things probably haven't changed. There's still abstract attachment to democracy, but a fair amount of willingness to put it aside when our other cherished values seem to be challenged by the democratic process. I want to say a little bit about work that I've been doing focusing on Europe, where a lot of these concerns are raised as well. I've studied over the last 20 years or so public opinion in Europe having to do with support for right-wing populism. And there too, you see, there's been a lot of talk about an explosion of right-wing populist sentiment in Europe over this period. But if you look at the data, it turns out that the average level of right-wing populist sentiment is almost completely constant over this entire 20-year period. What's changed is the willingness and ability of political leaders to exploit that sentiment by raising options in elections that didn't exist, for example, before, for people to support right-wing populist parties. And so the punchline of that research is that it's not a wave of right-wing populist sentiment, it's a reservoir of right-wing populist sentiment that politicians more or less successfully tap into at different times. And if you look at the responses to the big backsliding of democracy in Hungary and Poland over this period, you see a similar kind of pattern. First, the people who voted for these parties in the first instance were not particularly people who had right-wing populist sentiments. They were more or less conventional conservatives. But then once the political leaders were able to entrench themselves in power and begin to erode democratic checks and balances, they did that. And voters responded mostly with acquiescence. My interpretation is that they did that not because they were anti-democratic in some broad sense, but because they were observing what they took to be successful government. If you look at things like people's ratings of the trustworthiness of politicians or the competence of the government, or even more specific things like their satisfaction with health services or education, you see big increases in both Hungary and Poland after the right-wing populist governments became more entrenched, and indeed big increases in the average level of satisfaction with life as a whole among Hungarians and Poles in the wake of these events. And so I think their support of what we take to be undemocratic regimes is not so much an indication of any principled appreciation for undemocratic government, but rather a kind of pragmatic response to how things seem to be going in those countries.
Thank you. Lucas, please.
So, Professor, regarding the responsiveness of government, are your findings valid or equally valid for all election levels, national as well as state or local levels, for executive as well as legislature? Or are there differences in responsiveness between them?
I think we don't know exactly because we don't really have studies that are completely parallel in terms of the kinds of questions that are being asked and the kinds of policies that are being tracked. People who've studied state government do find similar kind of disparities between the preferences of citizens and government policy, and do see substantial differences in policy that have to do with the partisan preferences of the people in government rather than with any observable changes in public opinion. So I think qualitatively the patterns are probably similar, whether they're less bad or more bad than at the national level. I think we probably don't know exactly. At the local level, there really isn't much in the way of policy responsiveness because local elections mostly don't have to do with the same kinds of policy issues, and the importance or the salience of partisanship in local elections varies a lot, in part because of the way they're run. In many places, the candidates on the ballot aren't identified as Democrats or Republicans. In many places, those elections are held separately from national elections. And so that's a somewhat different pattern.
So the reason why I ask this is because many people believe that if the questions, if the political issues were more centered in more local level, then this responsiveness would be better. Then people would be more, would have more proximity to government, and it would be easier to have a responsive government. So you think that would not be the case? That doesn't make a difference?
I think there's a trade-off. On one hand, local government is in some sense more permeable to political activity on the part of an individual or a small number of people. So in that sense, I think it's right that you could have a better chance of making a difference locally than nationally. On the other hand, people in the US tend to know much more about national issues than about local issues. We have this idea and even an ideology that local government is closer to the people, but in fact, most people are very vague about what's going on in their local government, in part because of the structure of the news media in many parts of the country. Local news media are dying and people have much more access to national political information than they do to local political information. So if you ask people, what level of government do you have most confidence in, they'll say local government, but that's entirely a kind of folk response based on the idea that the local government is closer to them. If you ask them, what policies is your local government pursuing that you would like to change, they mostly have no idea.
Lucas, the last question.
Last question. Well, we have so much questions. Let me see what would be our last question. I think it would be nice to bring to a question here concerning Brazil. Here in Brazil, we have a very romantic view of democracy. The folk theory of democracy is not only pervasive, but also celebrated. We have an expression for the elections. We call it the party of democracy. Party in the sense of festivity, not of political parties. And when we talk about the problems of democracy, it's usually to conclude that we should have more democracy. What would you say to the people in Brazil who believe that more democracy, in the sense of direct democracy, is a solution to the problems of democracy?
There's a chapter in our book that tries to address specifically what happens when you let people decide things directly. Sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it goes very badly. I think for reasons that are parallel to the reasons that I tried to describe for elections not working very well. If you're going to have a referendum, somebody still has to pose the question, and the power that's involved in posing a yes or no question gives a lot of influence to whoever gets to do that, whether it's a community group or a special interest or the political leaders themselves. But there's also, I think, problems with people being able to make these judgments in a sensible way, given the information that they have to them. So one of the analyses that we talk about in the book is a case in the US where a particular state let localities vote on their fire department budgets. In order to get an increase in the budget, they had to bring this measure to the citizens and get a vote of the citizens to agree with it. And of course, citizens don't like paying taxes. And so the tax rate and the budgets of the fire departments went down successively over a period of 5 years or 10 years following the implementation of this new system. At the same time, if you track the actual seriousness of the fire risk and the amount of property damage that was done by fires, you see that it tracked up in the places where the government fire department budgets went down, and people were losing more in terms of fire damage and increased insurance premiums than they were saving in terms of their taxes. And so this was a case where letting citizens set the budget gave them the opportunity to shoot themselves in the foot by adopting policies that were pretty clearly counterproductive. Of course, there are other instances in which the decisions that they would come to would be pretty sensible ones. But on the whole, I think the idea that more democracy in the same romantic folk theory sense that we criticize would be the solution to our problems is often dangerous.
Professor, thank you so much for your class, because we had a wonderful lesson today. So I thank Fernando and Lucas that were here with us today. And on behalf of all our team, we would like to thank you and to invite you to come to São Paulo, hopefully in a near future.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you,
It's an
Professor.
honor for us.
Maybe
Bye-bye.
maybe we can ask the other questions when we see each other in person.
We have many, but there, I think many other events are going to come up. Thank you, Professor.
In the meantime, I would like all of you to think about what the Brazilian version of democracy for realists is going to look like after your current political experiences, whether views about democracy have changed or are going to change.
I think it's a great idea for Fernando's group about political behavior, and they should write a paper about it.
Yeah, I think so. I would like to thank you, Andrea, Lucas, and especially you, Professor Bartels. It's an honor for us to receive you here.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
A great honor. Thank you.
Great honor.
Boa tarde a todos. Muito obrigada pela participação. Até a próxima, gente. Tchau, tchau.
Até, tchau. Bye, bye.